Okay, so this is problem 4 from the end of chapter 2. And you have an example, this is problem 4, you have an example of two countries, Germany and Turkey, that can each produce t-shirts and or optical instruments. And you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 questions. What is the slope of Germany's production possibilities curve? Well, rise over run would be, if we go from here to here, negative 300 over 900, or negative 1/3. Obviously, those are downward sloping lines, right? So they're always going to be negative. What is the slope of Turkey's production possibilities curve? If we go from, again, here to here, we have negative 500 over 250, or negative 2, right? What is the opportunity cost of producing t-shirts in Germany? It turns out that the slope of the line is the opportunity cost of the good on the x-axis. So if you can remember that, then you will know that the opportunity cost of producing t-shirts in Germany is negative 1/3, and in Turkey it's negative 2. However, we should say negative 1/3 what? Because if you say negative 1/3, it doesn't indicate whether it's dollars or apples or what. So the opportunity cost of producing t-shirts in Germany is 1/3 of an optical instrument. This is a better answer. And in Turkey, it is 2 optical instruments. In fact, I would rewrite this problem to make it even more clear. I would write, what is the opportunity cost of producing 1 t-shirt in Germany and of producing 1 t-shirt in Turkey? And so then it's clear that if you produce 1 t-shirt in Germany, you give up the opportunity to produce 1/3 of an optical instrument. And if you produce 1 t-shirt in Turkey, you give up the opportunity to produce 2 optical instruments. Okay? And let me just illustrate this one other way. Because I wouldn't recommend that you just memorize the fact that the slope of the line equals the opportunity cost of the good on the x-axis. I would instead recommend that you think your way through the answers each time. So, what's the opportunity cost of producing t-shirts in Germany? I've done this before a couple times already. If you produce 900 t-shirts in Germany, you give up the opportunity to produce 300 optical instruments. So therefore, if you produce 1 t-shirt in Germany, divide this by 900, you give up the opportunity to produce 1/3 optical instruments. Divide this by 900. Yeah? The virtue of this technique that I just illustrated, you can go the other way as well and determine the opportunity costs of optical instruments. Right? So far we've just done the opportunity cost of t-shirts. Part E, what is the opportunity cost of producing optical instruments in Germany? So I already said that we were going to do that here. If you produce 300 optical instruments in Germany, you give up the opportunity to produce 900 t-shirts. Therefore, if you produce 1 optical instrument, you give up the opportunity to produce 3 t-shirts, right? So the opportunity cost of producing 1 optical instrument in Germany is 3 t-shirts. What is the opportunity cost of producing optical instruments in Turkey? Well, if you produce 500 optical instruments, you give up the opportunity of producing 250 t-shirts. In other words, if you produce 1 optical instrument, you give up the opportunity of producing 1/2 t-shirts. What is the opportunity cost of producing 1 optical instrument in Turkey? 1/2 a t-shirt. In which good does Germany have a comparative advantage? In which good does Turkey have a comparative advantage? Sometimes I like to create the following 2x2 table. Turkey, Germany, T-shirts, optics. You could call this a table of opportunity costs. So in Turkey, so let's call this table of opportunity cost. In Turkey, the opportunity cost of producing a t-shirt is 2 optical instruments. And in Turkey, the opportunity cost of producing an optical instrument is 1/2 t-shirt. In Germany, the opportunity cost of producing a t-shirt is 1/3 optical. And in Germany, the opportunity cost of producing an optical instrument is 3 t-shirts. So, in producing t-shirts, who has a lower opportunity cost? Turkey or Germany? Germany, because 1/3 of an optical instrument is less than 2 optical instruments, right? So therefore, Germany has a comparative advantage in t-shirt production. Its comparative advantage is lower. And I said in a previous lecture, you can't have a comparative advantage in both things. Therefore, Turkey has the comparative advantage in optical instruments. We can also see that because what's the opportunity cost of optics in Turkey? 1/2 t-shirt versus 3 in Germany. So the opportunity cost is lower in Turkey, therefore Turkey has a comparative advantage in optical instruments. Yeah? We could now imagine these countries pre and post trade. So imagine that right now each country is producing at the following points on their PPCs. But then they decide to specialize in trade. So what should Turkey specialize in? Optics. It should produce 500 optics. And Germany should produce all t-shirts. Now, they could trade. We don't know exactly what bargain they would strike. But if they traded 1 for 1, they would be better off, right? Because Turkey could give Germany 250 optical instruments and get 250 t-shirts in return, right? And they would go from point A to point B. So they're at a point to the right of their PPC, they're better off here, right, after trade. Similarly, Germany would have to give up 250 t-shirts, so it would be around here, and this would be 650, right? But then it would get 250 t-shirts. So it would go from point C to point D. So by specializing in the production of the good in which your country has a comparative advantage, and then trading with other countries, you can consume more than you would be able to produce if you didn't trade. That is really the key insight about international trade from this model. But this discussion of comparative advantage also has bearing on questions like, how should you assign tasks in your firm? Or how should you set up your factory? If you have people specialize according to comparative advantage, you will find that you'll have more efficient outcomes. Okay, so that's the problem from the end of the book. I did want to discuss quickly the Excel assignment that you submitted. So I have pulled up one of the submissions, and this is something that one of you turned in. And so the problem really had you produce 2 figures and then answer some questions. This figure is exactly what I wanted you to do. If it looks different but generally has the same information, that's that's perfectly fine. First of all, you see there's a scatter plot, right? Each of these points represents a country. And so if you know the point, you can figure out their level of economic freedom, which is on the x-axis, and also their average income, which is on the y-axis. This student also used Excel to fit a trend line here. And there are many software programs that will allow you to do this. This is a basic function of spreadsheets and other statistical software packages. And he included the equation of the line here. So the equation is negative 43,299 plus 965.87 times x, right? Where x is economic freedom. So if economic freedom goes up, x goes up, what we predict about average income, our prediction also goes up. Right? So there's a positive relationship as we see here. This equation is the slope of this line. The intercept is negative, right? Negative 43,000. So if you had zero economic freedom, we would predict you would have negative income, which I know it doesn't make perfect sense. That's because we have a straight line here. You could have selected, if I asked you to, quadratic or some other type of line. But here I just asked you to do a straight line, just to make things simple. Now, the other thing that's reported here is what's called the R squared. And when you take a statistics class, you will learn that the R squared is a measure of the strength of the correlation between these two variables. That's all you need to know for this class. A higher R squared means these variables are more highly related to one another. Or in other words, they are closer to the line. So here's the line. Some points are very close to it, right? And other points are farther away from it. These points are farther away from it. But they fit the line, the points fit the line, or I should say it this way, the line fits the points fairly well. And we see that in the R squared of 0.42. Because R squared is a number between 0 and 1. If it's 1, all the points are exactly on the line. It can't be higher than 1. So I'm not going to, I said this is not a class on statistics or empirical methods. But I just want people to know generally what R squared represents. And it is the strength of the linear relationship that we see here. So then this is the second figure that you were supposed to create. The x-axis, you have government size. And this is the fraction of government spending over total spending in the economy. So usually it can't be more than 100%. Only in one special case, somehow this country spent more than it had. But generally, it's a fraction. And we see most countries are between 20 and 60% of the economy is the government. You can think about this as a measure of whether you are more command socialist or market capitalist. Right? This is, in some sense, like the Economic Freedom Index, a measure of that. But a different way of measuring where you are on that spectrum, right, of economic systems. We have the same dependent variable, income. What do we find here with respect to the relationship? We find that being closer to command socialist is associated with what? Higher income or lower income? Look, this is percent of the spending in the economy by the government. So if it's more government spending, that's more command socialist. And what we see here is more command socialist, what? No, higher income, right? Look, the slope of this line is positive. You're saying lower income because that's what your intuition would tell you. That's what we said in the book, right? That you have higher income if you're closer to market capitalist. And we did find that in this graph, right? We found that now if you have more freedom, this means you're closer to market capitalist. And then you have more income. And that's what makes sense to you. That's what you thought you'd find, and you found it. Here, you thought this line would be negative, but in fact it's positive. Countries that spend have bigger governments are richer. So these are two contradictory pieces of evidence. In fact, this would cause us to reject our hypothesis that free markets produce higher income. Now, is there any reason that you might be skeptical of this result? And let me draw your attention to the r squared in particular. Is the r squared high or low? It's 0.02. It goes from 0 to 100. It's practically 0, right? This also illustrates something to watch out for in statistical testing. So we found a positive relationship, but actually the points are all over the place. It's not a strong relationship at all. Whereas the first relationship we found, the r squared was 20 times higher, right? So here we have a positive relationship, and we think it's a strong relationship because of the high r squared. Whereas here we have the unexpected relationship, but a weak r squared, so we might not put too much faith into that second one. But in any case, what about the questions? These are the student's answer, plus one of your answers. I'll comment on them and then tell you what I would have put. What does the slope of the line suggest about the relationship between economic freedom and income? How does your figure compare to the figure from the course reader? What are the policy implications? The slope suggests that the more a country's economy leans towards market capitalist system, tends to have more income. Okay, good. The scatter plot is similar to that in figure 2.15. Okay, good. He didn't, or she didn't talk about the policy implications. What are the policy implications? Less regulation, right? More choice to entrepreneurs. That is a policy implication of our findings. But what about the second line? What does the slope of the line suggest about the relationship between size of government and income? Again, there's a positive, not again, I shouldn't say again. I should just say there's a positive relationship between the size of government and income. That's correct. There was no comparable figure in the book. This was something that I asked you to do. But what are the policy implications? Just the opposite. Having more regulations is good. Right? Having a larger government is good. And so reread this section. Discuss what the findings suggest for the optimal form of economic system. Are your results conclusive? So I would say the optimal form of economic system that we read about here is one that leans towards market capitalist. But our results of our statistical analysis aren't conclusive. In other words, we found mixed evidence. So we might say having an economy that leans towards market capitalism, maybe even one that leans fairly heavily towards market capitalism, is good, but it seems that there is still something to be said for having a government. So in other words, economies that have zero governments aren't rich either, right? So it's a question about balance, in other words. That's the general thrust of what I was hoping you would say with the answers, but I will give you full credit if you get the figures correct and you have something reasonable here for the answers. Okay, so now the last thing we'll do is talk about quiz 3. I mentioned David Ricardo in the video lecture earlier, and he wrote a book, and this quiz asks you questions about that particular passage of his book that related to comparative advantage. So here's what he wrote. England may be so circumscribed that to produce cloth may require the labor of 100 men for 1 year, and if she, that's England, attempted to make wine, it might require 120 men. To produce wine in Portugal might require the labor of 80 men, and to produce cloth might require the labor of 90 men. So who's better at producing wine? Portugal. Takes them only 80 workers. Who's better at producing cloth? Portugal again. It takes them only 90 men versus 100. So Portugal is better in producing both things. But David Ricardo said there still can be gains from trade. If they specialize in the production of the good in which they have a comparative advantage and trade, we'll see that both are better off. So that's what this quiz asks you to do. And I go through it step by step. Now there is one new concept here that you haven't read about in the book, and that is absolute advantage. When I asked you a moment ago, who's better in wine production? You said Portugal. That means they have an absolute advantage in producing wine. They also have an absolute advantage in producing cloth. But what we'll see is they do not have a comparative advantage in producing both. A country you can't have a comparative advantage in both things. Okay, so let's figure out who has a comparative advantage in what. Let's begin with question 1, and then I'll have you work on them in your groups, and then we'll go through the answers. Okay, so one other additional assumption of this problem is that let's assume England has 1,200 workers and Portugal has 720 workers. And moreover, there's a constant opportunity cost relationship. In other words, these are going to be straight line PPCs, not bowed out. A bowed out PPC is more realistic, but straight line is simpler. And with models, more realism is not always better, right? Often simplicity is better. So to begin answering this first question, the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of wine in England, I would suggest that you start out with the following and draw the PPCs. So you know that England has 1,200 workers, and they can produce 1 unit of cloth with 100 workers. So if they use all their 1,200 workers to produce cloth, they can produce 12 units of cloth. If instead they use all their workers to produce wine, well, they have 1,200 workers. It takes 120 workers to produce a unit of wine. They can produce 10 units of wine. So this is England's PPC. Now let's do the same thing for Portugal. They have 720 workers, and they can produce wine with 80 workers. So if they use all their workers to produce wine, they can produce 9 units. And if instead they use all 720 workers to produce cloth, given it takes them 90 workers to produce cloth, they can produce 8 units. Okay, so these are what the PPCs look like. Now, I would suggest at this point creating a table of opportunity costs. And I'm going to just move this up here and then create this table below it. And this will help you answer these and other similar types of questions. So we have the opportunity cost of cloth and wine in England and Portugal. Fill this in. So in England, if it makes 10 units of wine, it gives up the opportunity to produce 12 cloths. So producing 10 units of wine gives up the opportunity to produce 10 units of cloth. If you divide both sides by 10, you can say producing 1 unit of wine gives up the opportunity of producing 6/5 units of cloth. So in England, the opportunity cost of producing wine is 6/5 cloth. Instead, if it produces cloth, if it produces 12 units of cloth, it gives up the opportunity to produce 10 units of wine. So 12 units of cloth gives up 10 units of wine. Divide both sides by 12. Opportunity cost of 1 unit of cloth is 5/6 units of wine. And you'll notice that this is just the inverse of the first one we did. And that's always going to be the case. Now, what about Portugal? If they produce 9 units of wine, they give up the opportunity to produce 8 units of cloth. Divide both sides by 9. If they produce 1 unit of wine, they give up the opportunity to produce 8/9 units of cloth. And then we know that you can do it the same way I showed you before, but you also just know that it's the inverse. Okay, so here we have a table of opportunity costs. Now let's determine which country has an opportunity cost of producing cloth. Which larger, 5/6 or 9/8? 9/8. So England has the lower opportunity cost. England has a comparative advantage in cloth because its opportunity cost is less than the opportunity cost of Portugal. And 8/9 is less than 6/5. So Portugal has a comparative advantage in producing wine. Returning to the quiz, what we just did with this table of opportunity costs will allow you to answer questions 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. For question 6, it's just an extension of the previous question. Based on comparative advantage, England should export the good in which it has a comparative advantage. And as we just saw, that's cloth, right? So England should export cloth and import wine. And Portugal should export wine and import cloth. I mentioned absolute advantage a moment ago. That's just to say which country is better. And we can say better with respect to labor productivity, but also total national output. And let me describe what I mean by that. We did see that Portugal requires 80 men to make wine, whereas England requires 120 men. So Portugal has an absolute advantage with respect to labor productivity in wine. And also an absolute advantage with respect to cloth, because it takes 90 versus 100. So Portugal has an absolute advantage with respect to labor productivity. But what about with respect to total national output? Let's look at these PPCs. This is to say, who can produce more? If England uses all its resources to produce wine, it can produce 10. If Portugal uses all its resources to produce wine, it can produce 9. So who has an absolute advantage in wine? England, with respect to total national output, right? So it's different than labor productivity. And also, same thing with respect to cloth. 12 is bigger than 8. Now, this is not meant to confuse you, these two different types of absolute advantage. What I wanted to illustrate is, especially even though Portugal is better at producing both, it still can be beneficial for them to trade. Question 8. Assume the population of Portugal doubles, then fill in the blanks. What you're going to see is this PPC for Portugal. What's going to happen to this PPC for Portugal? It's going to shift out, right? It's going to look like this because its population grew. Now its PPC shifted out. So now who has an absolute advantage in wine production with respect to total national output? Portugal. They can produce 18 versus 10. So Portugal has an absolute advantage with respect to total national output in wine and also cloth because 16 is bigger than 12. This question 9 is a question about the bargaining that countries will undertake in order to determine what is the rate of exchange. Now again, it's not literally true that countries negotiate with each other, right? Entrepreneurs in England negotiate with entrepreneurs in Portugal. But this is just a shorthand way of saying England, that they exchange. So it turns out that you're not going to trade unless what you're getting is at least equal as your opportunity cost. And if it's just equal, you won't bother trading. So it has to be either greater or less. I'll let you think about that. And then finally, which trade price would work? So before, when we were talking about the question, we said, imagine they trade 1 for 1. Well, 1 for 1 won't always work. Because you should check whether it actually can make both countries better off in the sense of, can both countries consume a point to the right of the PPC at that price? So you have to think about what price would work. Would 1 for 1 work, or might you need to select a different price?